Cardano and the whole crypto space are in for some battles. These will be important fights over unanswered questions, things like thresholds and definitions that will allow our current legal frameworks to be applied to crypto. What is a DAO? Is it a legal person, just an informal structure akin to the membership of a Discord or a forum, or is it just software? If membership in a DAO can impart liability, whether regulatory, civil, or criminal, what level of involvement with the DAO is sufficient for that liability? Can absolutist stances on things like censorship resistance even withstand the weight of the answers to these questions? Can the soul of crypto be preserved without all of us becoming outlaws? Or do DAOs just become bland corporation-like entities? These are some battles that we'll all be fighting soon, and they'll define us for a long time. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss the latest happenings in the UkiDAO case, a big crypto influencer deciding that Cardano will actually flip Ethereum, why your crypto lawyer never gives you actionable advice, a Cardano NFT selling for 180,000 ADA, and the launch of a new blockchain that was accompanied by something less than glowing praise. We'll also cover Coinbase adding a new service that may be less than welcome by some. If your first thought upon seeing this image was, hey bro, hey, those guys have spears. Are you trying to get me into a spear fight? Because I'm a keyboard warrior. I'm not trying to get into a spear fight. Don't worry, no spear fights. Or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Also, I am still looking for sponsors. I've had a lot of interest, and there are various things that prevent me from allowing certain types of projects from sponsoring the channel. So I really appreciate all the interest I've gotten so far, but I'm still on the hunt for sponsors. So if you are interested in sponsoring one or more of the videos on this channel, please hit me up on Twitter at Army Spies. No of, just at Army Spies. We're now a ways into the history of DAOs and crypto. We've talked many times on this channel about the exploit of the original the DAO in Ethereum. Now we've gotten to that point where there are a lot more DAOs out there, and we actually have to confront this question: what is a DAO? And it's important. It's coming up in this UkiDAO case that we've talked about multiple times previously on this channel, because it's pertinent to the question of who needs to be served in order for the CFTC to go after UkiDAO. Who needs to be served? Who is actually the subject of the CFTC's enforcement efforts here? Who are they actually litigating against? And you already know from the previous coverage on this channel, what the CFTC actually did was post in the help chat box at UkiDAO and also post in the forum. That's how they believe they sufficiently served UkiDAO, because they don't have an individual. They already went after the founders. They already went after the founders and this sort of lab entity, and they've already settled with those parties. Was it B0X and founders Tom Bean and Kyle Kistner. They've already settled with those guys, but the timeline here has been similar to a lot of lab founder DAO stories, and at some point the lab has handed over the protocol to the DAO, and so the CFTC says it had no choice but to, as CoinDesk puts it here, bring charges against the DAO, because the same illicit products B0X previously offered without registering or operating a Know Your Customer program have been offered by UkiDAO, and it's so egregious that the agency had no choice but to bring charges. So CFTC is not happy with what UkiDAO is doing, and so they just decided to go ahead and serve the DAO. Why did they serve the DAO? Because they've already gone after the founders, who are humans, and there's no legal person like a corporation to go after. So they said, hey, the Commodities Exchange Act has a definition of person, and that definition includes an association. So we're going to go ahead and say a DAO is an association, and we're going to serve and go after the DAO directly. Luckily, we have great attorneys working on our behalf in crypto, like those in the Lex Punk army, which includes these three: Stephen Pally, Samuel Moniz, and Alex Golubitsky, who filed this amicus brief in this case. So from the table of contents, we can see exactly what they're arguing here. They're arguing that a DAO is not a legal person under the Commodity Exchange Act or any other applicable U.S. federal law. So the CFTC must pursue its claims against individual DAO participants against whom this alternative service, where they served them via the help chat box and the governance forums, is not appropriate because they're actual humans. You have to serve them the normal way. They say a DAO is not a person under the statute's plain language, the statute being the Commodities Exchange Act, and also the alternative service part. You can see I jumped ahead to that section of the brief there. They also said treating UkiDAO as a person for purposes of service of the process exceeds the CFTC's authority under the Commodity Exchange Act. And here they make kind of an interesting some interesting arguments. They say the CFTC's role with respect to DAO personhood, token holder liability, and DAO membership are arbitrary and capricious. We expect this whenever they're dealing with an agency, but they say any determination that DAOs are futures, commodities, merchants, or otherwise have liability for DeFi systems is a legislative rule required to go through an APA required notice and comment period before it can bind anyone. And here they're kind of saying, hey, this is more of this regulation by enforcement. If you wanted to say that DAOs are futures, commodities, merchants, like they're saying UkiDAO is in this case, then you have to have the normal notice and comment period where they tell the public, hey, we want to consider DAOs futures, commodities, merchants. Give us some comments, for the required period of time. We'll look at all those. And this is the way that we ensure that we've taken the public's input on this, and also that everyone has notice that we're going to do this. And then all the DAOs would know, oh, hey, they're going to consider us futures, commodities, merchants. So these are the kind of arguments you expect attorneys to make, but it doesn't address the other issue. As consumers in the various crypto ecosystems, as consumers, do we really want the regulators going after the individual DAO token holders? Is that what we want? We want them to go after all the members of the DAO? Or is it kind of better that they just go after the DAO? Because if the judge is persuaded by this amicus brief and he decides, yeah, actually, the DAO is not a legal person under the Commodity Exchange Act, so you've got to go ahead and serve the actual humans who are DAO participants, the individual DAO participants, and you've got to go after them directly. If he were to make that ruling, then the CFTC is probably just going to start issuing subpoenas to figure out who's at the IP address of everybody who voted in the DAO, or everybody who has DAO tokens. And here's where it's going to get really, really messy, both for the consumers who obviously don't want the CFTC going after them, consumers in crypto who might be members of these DAOs, but also legally messy, because you have to start coming up with some kind of a threshold. What is the threshold? Does someone must someone have voted in favor of something that violated the Commodity Exchange Act? Because the DAO token holders, they're probably not voting like, hey, should we go out and violate the Commodity Exchange Act so the CFTC comes after us? They're not voting on stuff like that. They're probably voting on small, trivial stuff having to do with parameters and things like that. They probably inherited this whole business model from the predecessor lab type entity that the founders set up. The DAO inherited the business model from that previous probably corporate entity, and they probably never actually voted, hey, let's engage in this business model. So the CFTC is gonna have to say, okay, well, voting in favor of something that violates the CEA is not the threshold. Maybe it's just owning the tokens. Maybe we're going to argue that when you acquired the token, you were implicitly approving of the business model that the DAO was inheriting from that previous entity we've already settled with. Then you've got a problem. If they were to reach that conclusion, then everybody who owns tokens in the DAO has to worry at all times that the DAO might do something that some federal regulator finds to be a violation of their regs or the statutes that that have been enacted, that they sort of seat their authority under. This is a huge problem. We don't know where those lines get drawn. These would all be continued battles. If the regulators are directed to go after the individuals, then it becomes a question of what's the threshold? How much do you have to do with the DAO to find yourselves under the crosshairs of these federal regulators? Maybe that's where it ends up, but that's going to be a lot of battles for all of us in crypto. Obviously, what we would prefer would be for some court to come along and lay down a precedent that could be cited to say that DAOs aren't legal persons who you can bring your claims against federal regulators, and the nature of a DAO is too decentralized to hold any of the token holders responsible for the DAO running a protocol that you find to be in violation of, the statutes or the regulations that you operate under. That would be perfect. The problem with that idea, the problem with that hope, is that then DAOs would just run amok and do all the things that the regulators don't want them to do. It definitely does not seem like judges are going to be down with sort of gutting the entirety of federal securities and commodities laws and regulations just because people are using DAOs. Because obviously, if we had the precedent I just described, then everybody would just make a DAO for everything and completely run amok and violate every single commodity and securities law and regulation. And judges are not going to allow that result. So we're probably going to be in for some battles here. As much as some of you probably dislike the role played by the SEC and the CFTC in crypto, this next character may be just as polarizing for some of you. BitBoy says, I officially now believe that Cardano will eventually pass Ethereum in market cap and users. It won't be soon, but ironically, the slow roadmap for full ETH 2.0 rollout will be the Achilles heel. Timeline 6 to 10 years. I don't know about the timeline part, but I think a lot of us would agree we're probably in Cardano because we think that Cardano will either flip Ethereum, like he's kind of indicating here, or that Cardano will take some big chunk of market share from Ethereum at least. The reason why I think this is interesting, regardless of how you might feel about BitBoy, he is a very mainstream crypto character. There are a lot of very general crypto people who probably view the content he puts out. And when he put this out, you can see it was on October 15th. So maybe you could argue he was in preparation to attend Rare Bloom, or in the middle of Rare Bloom, or in some way he was either immersed in Cardano or about to be immersed in Cardano when he put out this tweet. But even so, putting this out, being a very general kind of crypto character, he probably has a lot more Ethereum listeners who would be alienated by this than Cardano listeners who would be delighted by this. And I'm sure he knows that. So the fact that he would go out on a limb and say this, I think it might be a good barometer of how much mainstream crypto is coming around to Cardano. If you are running a project in Cardano, you may have found yourself asking, why does our lawyer never give us actionable advice? We ask him if something is legal, and he pretty much waffles on everything. If you found yourself in that position, this thread by Marco Santori, head of legal at Kraken, might be for you. He says, Kraken Legal is now 56 deep. Yes, that's right. Kraken now has a legal department bigger than a lot of mid-sized law firms. Kraken Legal is basically a very large law firm. It's not big law level large, but it's pretty big. After reviewing over 1,000 resumes, I now present to you a thread of my observations on legal hiring. So the first part of this is the important part. He says, wait, why so many in-house lawyers, Marco? Because outside counsel is basically worthless on crypto issues. Many are super smart and get the tech. Sadly, they're constrained by liability worries and rarely give actionable advice. We use them as subject matter experts on narrow questions. So he's telling you right there, he had to hire a 56-person legal department, despite the fact that Kraken can obviously afford very, very good outside lawyers. They have to have these in-house lawyers because there's too much liability. The outside lawyers are too constrained by liability worries. They have to worry that Kraken is going to sue them for legal malpractice. If they say it's okay for Kraken to do anything, they have to worry they're going to get sued for legal malpractice if Kraken gets in trouble. So they rarely give Kraken actionable advice. If Kraken is having that problem, you can imagine that your project is probably substantially smaller than Kraken's project. You can imagine your attorney, if they're not willing to go out on a limb for Kraken, who would be a gigantic account at for most partners in a law firm, if they're not willing to go out on a limb for Kraken because of liability worries, they're definitely not going to go out on a limb for you. And the problem is the law is just too unsettled. It's not that your attorney doesn't know how to do law. It's that the law is too unsettled for them to give you any kind of actionable advice that wouldn't keep them up at night about you suing them for legal malpractice later. You already know that we almost never talk about the price of anything on this channel on purpose, but we're going to talk about this because I think it's pretty notable and it's an indication of where we are. So this popped up recently. The Ape Society has an NFT that sold for 180,000 ADA. That's 180,000 ADA. And it is quite a fine NFT. But if you were wondering where we are with Cardano NFTs, this is where we are. We've had some very high priced NFTs in the past, but this one kind of took me by surprise a little bit. 180,000 ADA. You might have noticed that Aptos launched recently. You'll remember we covered Aptos and Sui previously. Both of them kind of sound like art galleries where people would only wear like black turtlenecks, that kind of thing. But this was an interesting thread. I have no idea how much of this is accurate, but this is the kind of reporting I saw about the Aptos launched when I just kind of casually browsed Twitter on the topic. This person says, Aptos is broken. Aptos launched today. However, Aptos currently has a lower TPS than Bitcoin, and a majority of tokens are either staked or ready to be dumped on retail investors. Curious? Thread below. So he says, let's look at transaction speeds on Aptos. Aptos promises 100K TPS. However, the current TPS is somewhere around 4 transactions per second. Additionally, the majority of these transactions are not actual transactions. They're merely validators communicating and setting block checkpoints and writing metadata to the blockchain. We've seen this before with certain blockchains. They talk about TPS, but a lot of the transactions, in quotes, they're counting don't seem to be real transactions. It's hard to see how users can even use Aptos right now. I personally cannot find any RPCS nor connect with any validators to send transactions. Aptos knows something is wrong. Between Genesis and 1:30 p.m. Pacific, the Aptos Discord was disabled. Users couldn't chat or ask any questions. Again, I don't know how much this is accurate. This is just what this person's posting. Aptos Labs, if you guys knew something went wrong, why not announce it publicly instead of shutting down your Discord and pretending the launch went smoothly? Additionally, let's take a look at the tokenomics of Aptos using on-chain data. Too long to read? You are going to get dumped on. The only play I would make on Aptos is a quick farm and dump. And then he gets into all the tokenomics. He says this means that a bit over 80% of the token supply is controlled by the team and investors, as there was no airdrop nor other method as to earn mainnet Aptos tokens. However, this is an account for the remaining 200 million Aptos. Where could these liquid tokens be? Sitting in an investor's FTX account, waiting to dump on retail. Sitting in an investor's Binance account, waiting to dump on retail. The point is that nearly the entire token supply is going to private parties. There was never a public sale or another method where users could have earned tokens. However, not all hope is lost. Sui is another blockchain using the Move language with arguably better tech. And then he goes on and on about Sui. So you can imagine this is probably someone who's a proponent of Sui as opposed to Aptos. But I think we have found our new Salunavaxes. We now have Aptos and Sui we can talk about and watch them gloriously probably have a lot of the same problems we've noted with other competitor chains, but this should be some amount of sidelines enjoyment for people in other blockchains. If you weren't satisfied with Coinbase only having gigantic numbers of stake pools that affect decentralization in your favorite proof of stake blockchains, it's your boy, Brian Armstrong, coming at you with new capabilities for Coinbase. He says, Coinbase NFT now has mint capability, continuing to ship improvements which make NFTs trusted and easy to use for everyone. NFTs will continue to be a big deal over time. Don't let current market fool you, although the dominant use cases will likely shift over time. And he's retweeting this tweet from Coinbase NFT. Good news, anyone can now create a new NFT collection with tools to mint on the blockchain. In other words, if you've been wondering when mint, the answer is now. Why do I have this strange, sneaking suspicion that the very worst NFT collections will be minted on Coinbase? I can imagine some very, very bad NFT collections coming out of Coinbase NFT. I'm not saying that this isn't a service they should provide. Of course, they have their customer base and they should be free to provide whatever service they want. But I'm just saying these may end up being the very most hated NFT collections by people in the various ecosystems. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.